Welcome back, guys. So today we're going to do a quick review. All of these things you should remember. So here, of course, is Versailles, where King Louis and his predecessors lived. Marie Antoinette, who was married at 14, consummated the marriage at 7 years after she met King Louis, and then proceeded to have 4 children, one of which lived to adulthood. We've talked about the 3 estates and how things were really inequitable in France, and how the 3rd estate, when they were invited to the Estates General, decided to take the tennis court oath and finally gather up weapons from the Bastille in order to support the revolution. We've also talked about John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes, philosophers that affected the revolution. And yesterday we also talked about Frederick II from Prussia and Marie Antoinette's brother, the Austrian leader, and how the Declaration of Pillnitz had occurred and how France went to war. We left off talking about Jean-Paul Marat, and so that's where we'll pick up. So here we go. Most of the people involved in the government's changes in September of 1792 were members of the radical political organization called the Jacobin Club. One of the most prominent Jacobins was Jean-Paul Marat. During the Revolution, he edited a newspaper called Friend of the People, and in his editorials, Marat called for the execution, the death of all of those who continued to support the king. A little bit more about Marat. You read a little bit about him last night, but he was thin, high-strung, sickly, and a man whose revolutionary writing stirred up a violent mood in Paris. Because he suffered from a painful skin disease, he often found comfort by relaxing in a cold bath, even arranging things so he could work in his bathtub. During the summer of 1793, a lady named Charlotte Corday, who was a supporter of a rival faction, convinced the people to allow her an audience with Marat, pretending to have information about traitors. But once inside the private chambers, she fatally stabbed him as he was in the bathtub. And for her crime, she would go to the guillotine, of course. So a little bit before we talk about Max. So Marat wanted all of those who supported the king to die, and he had another friend named George Danton, a lawyer, and he was among the club's most talented and passionate speakers. He was also known for his devotion to the rights of Paris's poor people. The National Convention had reduced King Louis XVI's role from that of a king to that of a common citizen and a prisoner, and now guided by the radical Jacobins, it tried King Louis for treason. And as you read in your story last night, the convention found him guilty, and by a very close vote sentenced him to death. On January 21st of 1793, the former king walked with calm dignity up the steps of the scaffold to be beheaded by the machine, the guillotine. The National Convention also had to contend with the continuing war with Austria and Prussia. At about the time the convention took office, the French army won a stunning victory against the Austrians and the Prussians at something called the Battle of Valmy. Early in 1793, Great Britain, Holland, and Spain joined Prussia and Austria against France. Forced to contend with so many enemies, the French suffered a string of defeats. And to reinforce the French army, the Jacobin leaders in the convention took an extreme step. At their urging in February of 1793, the convention ordered a draft of 300,000 French citizens between the ages of 18 and 40, and by 1794, that number had grown to 800,000, and the army even included women. Terror grips France. Foreign enemies and armies were not the only enemies of the French Republic. The Jacobins had thousands of enemies within France itself, and these included all kinds of people like peasants who were horrified by the king's execution, priests who just wouldn't accept the seizure of their property and control, the rival leaders who were stirring up rebellions in provinces. How to contain and control all these enemies became a real big issue. In the early months of 1793, one Jacobin leader, Maximilien Robespierre, slowly gained power. Robespierre is in the top right corner. Robespierre and his supporters set to build a republic of virtue by wiping out every trace of France's past. They were really firm believers in reason. They changed the calendar, divided the year into 12 months of 30 days, renamed every month. The calendar had no Sundays because the radicals considered religion old-fashioned and dangerous, and they even closed all the churches in Paris, and cities and towns all over France soon did the same. In July of 1793, Robespierre became the leader of something called the Committee for Public Safety, and for the next year Robespierre governed France virtually as a dictator, and the period of his rule became known as the Reign of Terror. The Committee of Public Safety's chief task was to protect the revolution from its enemies, and under Robespierre's leadership the committee often had these enemies tried in the morning and guillotined in the afternoon. I read one article that said something like 18,000 people were guillotined during this Reign of Terror. Robespierre justified his use of terror by suggesting that it enabled French citizens to remain true to the ideals of the revolution. He also saw a connection between virtue and terror. The first maxim of our politics ought to be to lead the people by means of reason, and the enemies of the people by terror. If the basis of popular government in the time of peace is virtue, the basis of popular government in time of revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue without which terror is murderous. Terror with virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing else than swift, severe, indomitable justice. It flows then from virtue. This is Maximilien in something called On the Morals and Political Principles of Domestic Policy, a speech in a paper that he wrote in 1794. The enemies of the revolution who troubled Robespierre the most were fellow radicals who challenged his leadership. In 1793 and 1794, many of those who had led the revolution received death sentences. Their only crime was that they were considered less radical than Robespierre. By early 1794, even George Danton found himself in danger. Danton's friend in the National Convention, afraid to defend him, joined in condemning him. On the scaffold, he told the executioner, "Don't forget to show my head to people. It's well worth seeing." The terror claimed not only famous people such as Danton and Marie Antoinette, the widowed queen. Thousands of unknown people were also sent to their death, often on the very flimsiest of charges. For example, an 18-year-old youth was sentenced to die for cutting down a tree that had been planted as a symbol of liberty. Perhaps as many as 40,000 people total were executed during the terror. About 85% of those were peasants or members of the urban poor or middle class, for whose benefit the revolution had been launched in the first place. Something kind of interesting is that Max Robespierre also was a proponent of something called the cult of supreme being. It's kind of an interesting thing to describe, but the cult of the supreme being was this idea that France ought to seize onto this idea of like a cult-like religion almost. They believed in a supreme being, but they believed that a supreme being didn't interfere with men's lives, and that that men their lives should be ruled by virtue, and that enlightened thinking and virtue ought to rule the day. And so it was a really interesting kind of a thing that was going on. Hang on, let me show you a little bit more. He even had this this festival of supreme being created, in which there was this kind of fake mountain built, there were these statues, there was all sorts of like parading going on. He supposedly wore this blue suit and these gold pants, and he became kind of the head of this cult of the supreme being. This festival got held, and anyway, people, it wasn't atheist, but it was it was a belief in God, but at the same time, it was a God that didn't interfere in the lives of man. And then, like I said before, and it was really about enlightened thinking and a virtue that was supposed to rule the day, and it was supposed to be this new way of looking at all of France. Okay?
Maximilien Robespierre was a French lawyer and politician, and is known as one of the most influential figures of the French Revolution. Robespierre was born in Arras in northern France in 1758 and was educated in Paris. The young Robespierre was a bright student, and at the age of 17 he was chosen from the 500 pupils of his school to deliver a speech to the newly crowned King of France, Louis XVI. After he completed his law studies, he was admitted to the bar in Arras and began writing essays on politics and crime. Robespierre was greatly influenced by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, especially his ideas on virtue and virtuous living. Robespierre believed in the innate good nature of the French people and their ability to further the nation. His frequent and popular public speaking led to him being elected to a minor political role, and later a representative of the National Assembly. He then became involved in the Jacobin Club, a famous and influential political society. After a war with Austria, which was opposed by Robespierre, he urged the overthrow of the monarchy, and the French Republic was declared in 1792. Robespierre spoke at length against the king, and Louis XVI was guillotined in 1793 after being found guilty of conspiracy and attacks on public safety. Following the king's execution, insurrections and a lack of food caused division in the country, and the Jacobins took control and had their political opponents arrested for opposing the revolution. France was now controlled by the Committee of Public Safety, which was unofficially controlled by Robespierre, making him the de facto dictator of the country. Through Robespierre's speeches and through increasing disorder in France, the committee began what is now known as the Reign of Terror, the ruthless elimination of all people considered enemies of the revolution. This resulted in around 20,000 executions by guillotine, including Marie Antoinette and the leading chemist Antoine Lavoisier, and another 25,000 deaths from firing squads. Tens of thousands of additional victims were also killed in several massacres across France. Robespierre then established the cult of the Supreme Being, which was made official religion of France and was based on the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Deist religion. Robespierre's introduction of the Decree of 22 Pereille, where executions were then carried out without trial, led to his downfall as the French people began to question his rule, and the other members of the convention conspired to overthrow him. Robespierre and his followers were declared outlaws by the convention, and he was executed by guillotine without trial in 1794.
Last piece for today. End of Terror. In July of 1794, fearing for their own safety, members of the National Convention finally turned on Maximilien Robespierre. They demanded his arrest and execution. The Reign of Terror, the radical phase of the French Revolution, ended on July 28th of 1794, when he went to the guillotine. French public opinion shifted really dramatically after Robespierre's death. People of all classes had grown really weary of the terror and of violence in general. They were tired of the skyrocketing prices for bread and salt and other necessities of life. In 1795, moderate leaders of the National Convention drafted a new plan of government, the third since 1789, and it placed power firmly in the hands of the upper middle class and called for a two-house legislature and an executive body of 5 men known as the Directory. These 5 were moderates, not revolutionary idealists. Some of them were corrupt and made themselves rich at the country's expense. Even so, they gave their troubled country a period of order. And they also found the right general to command France's armies, Napoleon Bonaparte. And next week we'll definitely be spending time, well actually in the next couple of days we'll be spending time on Napoleon. There he is.